Yeah, those roles of counsellor, coach, psychologist, they do, if you're doing it well, they're going to expose everything in you that's not congruent or authentic. It's going to come to the surface. And so who you have to be effective in those roles is to put yourself under the microscope first. Otherwise, how are you going to be able to be there in a room with someone whose life's falling apart if you haven't attended to how your life has fallen apart and clean those areas up? And so who you have to be in that role is you do have to have your integrity and your responsibility and your accountability and your transparency and your honesty. You have to have all these things taken care of. Otherwise, you're going to be quickly exposed and not very effective.
Yeah. There's nowhere to hide in a counselling session for the therapist or the client. So it's
if it's done well.
If it's done well, yeah. In the early days, if I did have a client that was sitting in front of me that did trigger issues that I hadn't dealt with, it was very, very obvious.
and then the client starts giving you some counselling.
Pete Isaiah is a trauma therapist and integration coach, supporting individuals and couples to become their most empowered and courageous, authentic selves. This podcast features inspiring conversations with graduates of Pete's shadow work courses and deep dives with experts in the arena of alternative health and current affairs. Here, we're not victims, we're volunteers. Are you in?
In today's episode, I have a long conversation with a colleague and friend of mine, Andrew Campbell. Andrew works as a counsellor, and in particular the cohort that he's worked with men who are perpetrators of domestic violence. So we have a deep exploration of that conversation and what's going on for the men and how they can be stigmatised. And really those men, 90% of them, don't want to be showing up that way, and when they do get the support they need, they're able to turn things around and take responsibility for that behaviour. And then also in the conversation each of us share about our own experiences in our relationships and how we've showed up in our relationship as, maybe not the best version of ourselves, and what we can do about that and explore our masculinity so that we can show up as a better version for our partners. It's quite a deep and exciting episode, so if you're interested in those topics, I'd encourage you to listen. Thank you. So my guest for today's episode is a dear friend of mine, a colleague, collaborator. You've been a successful businessman in the first half of your life, and then at some point you decided to have a change of career and become a counsellor. And I've come to you for counselling before, and I find that you've got quite elite level skills in your counselling. And so I want to welcome you today, Andrew Campbell.
Thank you, Peter. Lovely to be here, finally. It's been a pleasure knowing you over the years and going through a very similar journey, and to be here today to be of service to you as well as to collaborate is a great honour. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. So we've got quite a few things in common in that we're similar age. We're both counsellors. I'm also a coach. I believe you're a coach and mentor as well. You've worked with. You were telling me, in your counselling career, one of your cohorts that you specialised in were male perpetrators of domestic violence. Is that correct? Yeah,
that's correct, Pete. Yeah, from 2005 to about 2013, I was very much involved in an NGO that I worked with, and also a lot of research and putting programs together for an all-of-family approach to domestic violence. So that was a big part of my life in that particular time.
I think we'll get stuck into that, but before we do, I want to hear a little bit more about your earlier life, because you owned petrol stations or something, so you were quite successful as a businessman. Can we go into that just to get a background and then how you changed from being in business to becoming a counsellor? But I want to hear a bit about your early business life.
Sure. Yeah, so I got married at 20, and I also went into business with a partner at 20, buying a petrol station in Sydney. and it was a big part of my life. Obviously, just expanding into the world. Really excited about life and being a little entrepreneur and putting my dent in the universe. And it was a very exciting time. And I bought a little block of land up in the Blue Mountains and built a home. And then I sold that first business when I was 25, owning my property and looking for my next direction in life. So that was very exciting time. I moved up to the Central Coast, bought another property, and in my late 20s I was very interested in Taekwondo. I got my black belt, and then I became an instructor. I was teaching, and when I was about 37, the service station that I owned at that particular time, one of the cars caught on fire, and in the driveway, and we weren't sure if there was children in the back. And the car was full of smoke and full of flames, and I was called from my office, and I ran out, and I had to run into the car to see if there was anybody in there, and I had to run from house to house for the surrounding houses to make sure that I warned everyone about an imminent explosion, and we had the fire brigade, emergency services, and it was a huge day, and really emotionally draining. And I chose to go to OzTag that night, which I was the captain and organised that team. And in that process, I knew that I was physically and emotionally drained, but a sense of guilt and responsibility pushed me to attend. And from that game we had, I snapped my ACL. And from that point, I can remember sitting in the hospital with my leg bandaged on crutches at 3 a.m. in the morning thinking, oh no, it's all over. And so I wasn't able to continue being an instructor. So that's something that was very important to me, gave me a lot of sense of self and direction and purpose. Had stopped. I subsequently, due to the pain and the injury, could not manage my business interests anymore, which I had to sell those very quickly because of not being able to give that attendance to them, and my marriage broke down at the same time. So I had the big three happen, and then I found myself living with a friend of mine in a little single room with plenty of time to reflect on what had happened. So that was my the first time that as I reflect how the patterns and narratives in my life I'd let sabotage my life to that point.
So when you say the big three, so there was a breakdown in your health and well-being with the injury, and then a breakdown in your business and career because you couldn't attend to the service stations, and then a breakdown in your marriage. So it's like a midlife crisis, like a perfect storm.
Yes, the universe brought that on very, very nicely.
Brought you to your knees.
Absolutely.
And so was it so that was at age 37?
37, yeah.
And so you couldn't be a Taekwondo instructor anymore. And so it's interesting because you would have lost quite a lot in terms of even status. Like as an instructor, you have a certain amount of status, and in that Taekwondo community, you would have been not necessarily looked up to, but looked to as a role model for discipline and that kind of thing. And then you've lost the status of husband in your relationship and lost the status of a businessman by owning those successful businesses. So it's quite a lot was no longer available to you. How did that affect you in terms of your mood, or how did you cope?
I didn't cope. It was very difficult at first. But as the months rolled on, excuse me, I realised that the importance of status, or how I built my masculinity externally, it was with the status of being an instructor, third degree black belt instructor, that had status to it. So it added to how I felt about myself in my masculine. Running a business and having money, it all went into this external self-esteem or masculinity rather than coming from something deeper, more authentic and real within myself. So there was some insight around that, probably 6 to 12 months after that happened. But there was also at that same time, there was also what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now? And it made me look, my situation or circumstances made me look a little deeper. So even though it was a very difficult time, the double-edged sword of the universe is that, it's a difficult time. It threw me into a very, very difficult time, but it was also being burned to learn. So it also gave me that opportunity to look at what wasn't working and what part I had in that, those the sabotage processes I had in that. So I decided then I wanted to go to college. I wanted to be a counsellor. I wanted to help people. I wanted to work on myself. There was a strong commitment within myself, and to share that with others and to be involved in a more humanistic way. And that was also a dream of mine when I was 16, 17. I wanted to be a psychologist or a counsellor, but I didn't get the opportunity to do that. But that part of my masculinity that I had to confront, I can remember a time where I had my leg bandaged, I was on crutches, and I was driving home, I think from a hospital visit. And these three guys in a car overtook me, and I must have done something inadvertently. But they were wanting it was like a road rage incident. They were wanting to pull over, and they were shaking their fists, going pull over, pull over. And I clicked into the old Andrew, and I thought, okay, you're on. And I put my blinker on and went to pull over, and then I thought, I can't. I'm on crutches. I'm totally helpless. I can't even defend myself. And it was a huge wake-up call to how I got my value as a man and how I saw myself and my masculinity. So now I'm penniless, helpless. How then do I form some sort of worth within myself and as a masculine and as a man? So it was a very intrinsic time to really confront those messages from society and how I took those on myself.
Yeah, well, what I'm hearing there is that, when is this, third Dan black belt instructor, that is one aspect of masculinity. It's almost like the superhero archetype. And then you got your successful businessman. So then that, that's your magician part of the masculine archetype. So I'm nailing my magician role. Here I am as the warrior and the lover.
Yep.
And so the king's not quite there, but the lover, the magician, and the warrior all well taken care of. Then you get this injury, and that takes down all three.
Yep. Excuse me.
And what you now are in is like what I call the dark night of the soul, or midlife existential crisis, where these external signs of masculinity were easily threatened or easily taken away. And in psychology, they have this concept of an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. And so for you were taking your cues about what it is to be a man from these externalities. Like, look at me, I'm an instructor, I'm a successful businessman, I'm a husband. And then when you lost those and you had this time where you're bound up because your knees out of whack, and you had some time to self-reflect, and so then you've got to look inside and go, what does it mean internally to be a man? How do I define my masculine from an internal point of view? And then at that point, you decided that you were going to go to university and study to become a counsellor.
Correct.
And it's quite a change from businessman, taekwondo instructor to counsellor. But you said at 16 and 17 you had this idea or dream that you'd be a psychologist one day. What was it about you that drew you to wanting to work with people as a counsellor? What quality was it? Also, before I go there, and you can answer that, so there was a study done by a English psychologist, and they looked at why people went into counselling and psychology as a profession, and they discovered that 75% of people that went into those professions did so to learn more about themselves. So was there some aspect of that in you that you chose counselling as a way to, as self-inquiry, self-discovery, as well as serving others?
I think it was, very much so, Pete. I think it was an umbrella of things that drew me to that perspective. But one of the big ones was, again, status. To be the shaman, or to be the, knowledge is power. So there was a big part of it. There was part of me that was still looking for some status within myself. But this time it had something better to give to myself and to others. And it was more in line with a purpose that was more fulfilling, more real than in the other masculine pursuits of my 20s and early 30s. But looking back, I think that I think they're developmental stages. So I think in the teens and 20s, I think it's important to follow those. Looking back, I think those things are important to find, and I think the journey in and out of those is very important as well. So it's so I see it now in reflection as a developmental stage of my masculinity and value. But yet, going into counselling, there was something deep within me that wanted to work with people on that level. My family of origin experience was that I was the scapegoat in the family. I come from a family of 7, and my role was very much pointing out the dynamics, the hidden dynamics within the family. And there was part of me that, from that family of origin experience, developed a raw sense of being able to see the dynamics and to name them. And to even come under a lot of criticism and attack for that at the same time. So I think it's a very particular role, and I think it's a role that served me well, to be able to have a raw sense of the hidden or the underlying dynamics that happen within a family or within a couple or within yourself. That is sort of that raw training that I got from my family of origin. And there is another side to me that's very a strong spirituality, very strong sense of my Catholicism, which I found that my family gave to me in my schooling. Even though it's not perfect, it gave me a great base, if that makes sense, to work off. Then that my spirituality and my relationship with Jesus has evolved over that period of time, but that my work allowed me to use that and to develop that as well. So it was all coming together in a more fulfilling and a more spiritual and a more deeper sense in my late 30s and early 40s of my purpose in this life and the meaning that I was to get out of life and who I was.
Are you saying that once you switched over to this counselling role in being of service to others, that you found more fulfilment or more purpose than you did as a businessman or taekwondo instructor?
Yeah, absolutely. I had to be successful at my job, or if we go back to when I was in college, I had to start to give a certain part of myself. I had to open myself up to a certain level, and counselling being a relational profession, where to be successful at that, you have to be open and vulnerable and real in that process, and that allowed me to, probably for the first time, to access that part of me. that also helped within my journey of the masculine, because I believe that, the strength of a masculine is that strength in vulnerability. When I can stand behind who I am and stand strong in my ethics behind that, I think that started to build then in tandem with my work, a strong sense of internal ethics and a strong sense of who I was, and also the importance of not breaking that, how important those ethics were for me. That gave me a sense of pride in, that I couldn't get from other external places. So in my role, to be ethical, to be non-judgmental, to be able to hold space for people, to be able to self-reflect, to be able to turn up in that role, started to evolve my own personal growth and development, and allowed me to really feel into a strong masculine place that I didn't have access to.
Yeah, those roles of counsellor, coach, psychologist, they do, if you're doing it well, they're going to expose everything in you that's not congruent or authentic. It's going to come to the surface. And so who you have to be to be effective in those roles is to put yourself under the microscope first. Otherwise, how are you going to be able to be there in a room with someone whose life's falling apart if you haven't attended to how your life has fallen apart and clean those areas up? And so who you have to be in that role is you do have to have your integrity and your responsibility and your accountability and your transparency and your honesty. You have to have all these things taken care of. Otherwise, you're going to be quickly exposed and not very effective. Yeah.
There's nowhere to hide in a counselling session. For the therapist or the client. So it's
if it's done well.
If it's done well, you're absolutely right, Pete. So that process really helped because I wanted to do well at it. I wanted to succeed in it, and for many reasons, as I said before, for the fulfillment, for the self-development and my growth, as well as to share that with others as well. And the point you made there is very pertinent as well around I can only take a client as far as I've gone.
Yeah.
And in the early days, if I did have a client that was sitting in front of me that did trigger issues that I hadn't dealt with, it was very, very obvious.
and then the client starts giving you some counselling.
Well, it did happen in one particular stage where I had to go external supervision, and I was working for a NGO at that particular time. So I had to put my hand up and say, look, there's, I'm getting a bit of transference from these particular clients. And again, doing that was the ethical thing. And in the counselling world, being able to put your hand up and be able to name, your vulnerabilities is a strength, which I like. And it plays into what I think is that strength in masculinity, and to have your head high and shoulders back, and be able to say, in your work, or as I did in my work, I'm struggling in this area.
Yeah. And
putting my hand up and saying, and that's okay. And then being able to do the work, and the benefit that comes from that is that trigger or that trauma that I was carrying was exposed, was a blind spot, and then I got the opportunity to work on it. And then going back into the therapy space, was able to give the gold that I'd found from that, and to be able to share that with others. So there's a very strong part of me that believes that when you find the gold in your trauma, that allows you then to give it as a gift to others and to hold people in theirs.
Yeah, so what I've heard you say twice now is this concept of the masculine being able to be vulnerable, because normally the masculine traits are seen as, like strong, in control, dominant, penetrating, competitive, all these kind of strengths. But there's another whole component to the masculine, to be able to be vulnerable, to know one's weaknesses, to know when you've screwed up and made a mistake and to come clean about that, or to know when you've completely messed up and to go back and take accountability and responsibility for where you've made that mess.
Correct.
As opposed to hiding those vulnerabilities and insecurities and giving some sort of false persona of being masculine. So masculine's not all strength, it's also being able to acknowledge where your weaknesses are and to highlight those and then work on those weaknesses. So there's this vulnerability and this being able to admit I'm human and I make mistakes, and here's where I made a mistake and here's what I did about it. I recently had to interview some people for some positions in my business, and one of the questions I asked one of the persons is, can you tell me a time in a position that you held recently where you made a big mistake and what you did about it? Because what I was wanting to hear from them is that, because I know that I have this part in me that if I make a mistake, you want to sweep it under the carpet and not deal with it. And what I've learnt to do as a man is that if I do make a mistake, to come clean about it, to put my hand up and go, hey, that was me, I really fucked up there. And I want to take responsibility for that, and I want to clean that mess up rather than leave it to someone else. And so that was a real significant shift in me, because it was a part of me that used to be quite shifty and dodgy and wanted to get away with stuff, and that would really erode my masculinity. And it was only when I really was willing to take responsibility for all the places in my life where I was making a mess, and I was making a mess in a lot of places in my life, that was a real turnaround. It was that sense of accountability and responsibility that comes from acknowledging your vulnerability and your weakness. So is that an aspect of, because that's what I'm picking up from you, that's an aspect of masculinity that we agree on?
Yeah, absolutely, Pete. I think that a man standing behind his values and not backing down from those. If he's in a social setting or a work setting and he has ethical values, that he's able to voice those and stand behind them regardless of any pressure. And I also think that's internally as well, to be able to stand strong behind your vulnerabilities. And I think it's important for men too, that you can own who you are and your vulnerabilities or your insecurities. But I think it's very important that you stand strong in that, and you do that from a place of power with, rather than a less than position, going in and as it's a weakness, and I'm shoulders down and head down in a lot of shame. Look, I've done something wrong. I don't think that's very productive, and I don't think that's helpful, and it invites a certain response from the other. I think it's very important that your head's high, your shoulders are back, and that you stand behind it in a strong way, very empathic way, to be able to listen to the other person and listen to yourself, and that you are standing strong in that, in your masculine.
Yeah, so when you're revealing your vulnerabilities or your mistakes, you're not doing it from a position of collapsing into the calamity of that, but rather in an empowered way, seeing those parts of self that are weaknesses, but without lowering how you feel about yourself or how you respect yourself. And then those challenges or weaknesses that show up just highlight where it is that you need to do the work. So it's not a disempowering thing, it's an empowering thing to acknowledge one's vulnerabilities and weaknesses.
Yeah, and it's also a state of being as well. So it's getting into that state of being where this is who I am and I'm okay. And I have faith in myself, faith in who I am, and faith in something higher than myself, whatever that might be. So it's also walking in faith. And I think that's another pillar of masculinity that I've found has been very helpful, to have that, have a strong faith in Jesus is that relationship I have. And I think that is one of the strong pillars that I have, that being able to do what we just said, to be able to stand strong in this world as a man and stand behind my ethics and my values and voice those, I think is very important for our children, for my sons, that I can stand very strong and role model who I am and what's important to me. And when those are pushed, to be able to stand strong in being able to express and explain what's underneath that. And I think that's a very important role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so can we go now to, I want to talk about, because I'm really intrigued and curious about this. So you've worked with a particular demographic as a counsellor where you were specialising in male perpetrators of domestic violence. I don't even know if that's the right way of describing your clientele, perpetrators, but men who were in relationships where there was domestic violence, and you were working as a counsellor to support those men with what they were dealing with. And so would you be willing to explain what that was like, why you chose that particular cohort, what you discovered about what were the patterns that you saw, what did you learn about those kind of relationships and the roles of both the men and the women in those relationships?
Yeah, that's a big question, Pete.
Let's start with, why did you choose that particular cohort?
Yeah, I shouldn't say a big question, it's a deep question, so it's challenging me, so thank you. The terminology we use that was most respectful was men who use abuse, or men who use controlling and abusive behaviours. So it's very, very much separating the person from the behaviour.
Yeah.
It was my first job out of college. I was an intern at a particular NGO as part of doing my hours in college, and I was working with groups of men that had been mandated to do a behaviour change program, so violent offenders. And my mentor at the time said, there's a job going, and he offered it to me, and I said, I'd love to take it. And he said, if you can do this, if you can learn this particular cohort and this particular modality to work with these men, he said, you can do anything.
Right, I would agree with that.
So I said, I'm in. So it was a really beautiful challenge, and I always like to be challenged. I think if I'm not challenged, I don't have that energy behind me, and I've always liked to be challenged over the years with whatever that is, and it's and again, the fulfillment of then obviously reaching a goal that's really challenging you is, as we spoke about before, that's something that enhances my value or masculinity or even existentially, what we're here for. So those particular endeavours over the years of starting to fulfil those, the existential angst and who am I and what's my value, where does that come from, and putting that all together. So that was another time in my life where that happened, and it was particularly challenging because the majority of these men didn't take responsibility for their behaviour. They weren't coming in asking for change. They were mandated. It was very much having to learn a way to meet these men and to be able to work with them in a respectful way. So that took a lot of training and a deep journey within to be able to respect and meet these men at a very deep and vulnerable place for them, but at the same time hold them accountable. And it's and my mentor was correct. That's a very tricky place, and if you can learn that or learn part of that, it helps you in every other area of your life.
So you were able to do that? You were able to reach these guys who didn't want to be there?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So before we even go one step further, what did you learn? What did you decide about how you had to be as a man to reach these men who didn't want to be there, weren't interested in doing the work? It's a court diversion thing. The court's saying you have to do this program for behaviour change. They're like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to change my behaviour. There's nothing wrong with me. It's the women that are the problem. And so somehow you have to change how you're being as a man, how you're showing up to reach these men. What did you decide about how you had to be in order to make that connection and establish that rapport?
A realisation that I'm the tool, I'm the conduit for that. Using, like in any relationship, trying to use force to coerce somebody to be accountable or to is fruitless, and so in knowing that I had to change, I had to learn a way of being that was safe, that was authentic, that was real, but was also compassionate, empathic, patient, because these men had been treated by the judicial system, through police, through community. They were demonised. They were defensive. They were angry. So I learnt very quickly, if I didn't treat these men with respect, nothing would happen. It would go nowhere. Unable to build rapport, unable to get them to start the process. So in doing that, I started to form a model. It was the invitational model. How do I invite these guys into this process? So it was, what it was doing was what I call putting the bar up high, challenging these men. Is this the type of man you want to be? So a very strong narrative-based model on finding their ethical ceilings. Every man has an ethical ceiling, regardless of what he's done. And it's finding his ethics, expanding on those, finding out who he is, what's important to him. And obviously if these behaviours, are getting him in line with those ethics or his needs. But first of all, I realised that for this therapy to happen, I had to attend to the man's protest.
You had to attend to the man's protest?
To his internal protest.
Okay, yeah. Say more about that.
Yeah, because they would come as the victim. And as I said before, victim of the system, a victim of society, a victim in their relationships. So they had a protest. It wasn't fair. What their wife did wasn't fair. And it was first being able to meet them and to acknowledge their protest. Hey, what happened to you is not okay. What happened to you and your journey is traumatic and is not fair. And absolutely. And once I realised that being able to acknowledge and connect with their internal protest, the defences would start to come down.
Yeah.
And then, so for me, it was about really building a relationship with these guys, but at the same time being very real with them about why they're here, what's happened. So it was a sort of a dual process. Yes, I'm here for you. I'm very much here for you. I'm here because I want you to be the best version of who you can be. But also at the same time, I'm going to name what's happened. I'm going to name these things, and I'm going to work with you. I'm going to be straight with you. So building very strong contracts with them around our relationship, and how they want to be treated, how they want this to go, what I can do, what I can't do, what happens if something gets triggered in that relationship, how do we deal with that? So very respectful, very contractual, and using immediacy in that process for whatever they bring into that process, that we're able to name it and we're able to work with that. But so yeah, very much working with that internal process, and once they've been heard, once they've acknowledged that, hey, you know what's happened to them is not okay, and that their protest or their injustice is just as real. However, the way that they manage that internal protest, or the way they manage that injustice wasn't wasn't respectful for the other person or for them. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you were able to adapt in how you were being to reach these guys successfully, and I suppose some of that was your training, but then some of that would also be intrinsically who you are temperamentally. So did you discover that when you were able to reach these men and build some rapport, was it that they didn't want to be showing up that way and that they did have some remorse or regret or shame or guilt about how they were behaving? Or do you think they were more righteous in justifying their behaviour? What did you discover? Or I suppose it was a mixed bag.
Yeah, generally speaking though, once I started to evolve the invitational model, it was more about not shaming these men, not punishing these men, not rubbing their nose in it, which obviously just contributes to more shame. And, shame is part of the trigger that creates that cycle. So inadvertently you're reproducing, stronger perpetrators and playing into the cycle if I do that as a therapist. So what I found is that once we started to work and invite them into that process, it was all about, instead of, as I said, that process, it was more, what sort of man do you want to be? It was about them. It was about reaching their peak. It was about reaching and being ethical and real and vulnerable, and about making them better men. And that was the invitation that 90% of them took up.
Okay.
When it wasn't focused on their bad behaviour.
Right.
The focus.
Yeah.
When it wasn't about shaming them. It wasn't about making feeling guilty. When it was about, this is about you being in line with who you really are. This is about empowering you. And once, and taking them through that process, 90% of them would engage dramatically in that process. And then I'd get most of those men saying to me after that and through that process, Andrew, why wasn't I ever taught this before? How come I didn't know this before? Well, I've wasted my life. Yeah. That now, instead of trying to control something that was deeply hurtful to them and feeling they had no choice, trying to control the world, trying to control their partner's behaviour, so they wouldn't be hurt or wouldn't be shamed, that they now had a different focus that was never there before, and that was their own self-respect. And focusing on that, and then because back in the early 2000s, I got a lot of flack from different organisations about empowering men in the domestic violence circles. But as we know now in 2024, an empowered man walks away from a woman who cheats rather than bash her. A man walks away from a woman who's disrespectful verbally without hitting her. So the process was about empowering men to make choices that are in line with their strong masculine.
So you were appealing to the better side of them that they didn't have access to because how they were showing up in their relationship was very reactive, and they didn't feel like they had a choice because they didn't have the skills to manage conflict well, so they fell into dysfunctional patterns of behaviour, arguments which can lead to physical violence, etc. And then you quote like this figure of 90% of them, when they saw that they weren't living up to the best version of themselves, they picked it up quickly and said, oh, why wasn't I taught this before? Yeah, I want to live into that best version. That remaining 10% is the natural 10% of the population that is sociopathic. Yep. So 10% of people, while you could argue between 5 or 10%, are sociopathic, and that they're not interested in being a better version. They're interested in mayhem and malevolence. So you would have noticed a small subset of your cohort were those kind, and you're not going to make a difference with them. But you're saying 90% of the men that are engaging in those behaviours do have regret and remorse about how they're showing up, probably some shame and guilt about it, but they've never been shown how to step into their empowered masculine. And so it's like the tyrant king or the benevolent king. And so they were showing up as the tyrant king in their relationship in terms of archetype. and your job was to invite them into being the benevolent king, and what that takes, and what takes responsibility, first of all, for cleaning up the mess you've already made. So in your process with these men, was that part of your structure or your program, was that they had to take responsibility for any mess that they'd made, or do you not deal with the past and you just try and build them into a new future?
That was the invitation. That was what drew these men in. And a lot of them, their fathers before them were violent, their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. And sometimes, the men in the 90s, 80s, 90s and 2000s were sort of the first generation that were really challenged about domestic and family violence. So it was quite challenging for them, because there was a lot of role modelling from their father and grandfather and the patriarchy and the messages from society. So they were challenging those at the same time. But what really got to them was that feeling of empowerment, that feeling when I really step into my masculine, when I really stand behind who I am, that shame melts away. And some of them, that's the first time they've ever felt that sense of self in themselves. As a lot of men walk around in quiet desperation and in toxic shame, and it's sort of a hidden epidemic. And inviting men into that place, I would see them change significantly. I'd see their energy and who they wanted to become. There was excitement in that place for them. There was a way out of this. So that was the first part, but accountability was a big part. It was around responsibility, accountability, and restorative practice. So just change was not enough. Part of the programs that I did, I introduced a part where they'd go back to own their behaviour. And an intrinsic part was a lot of these guys were in their 30s and 40s and early 50s. And one of the weekly programs was to go back and have a conversation with mum and dad. And just that one-on-two. And the purpose of that meeting was to have that private, to ring mum and dad up, say, look, there's something I want to chat to you about. So it's private. And it was to start to own the story that comes with it. Because a lot of the times where these men have been using power and control and abuse, many forms of that, and many tactics of that, there was a story that they create within their families and extended families and within their society. And that is that she's the problem, she's a bitch, she won't leave it alone, she's a flirt. So it's starting to convince the family and the extended family and social structure around that man that it was her fault. So going out to see mum and dad and having that conversation to say, hey mum, it's not her. It doesn't matter what she does. It's my choice to be abusive. That's my stuff. I own that, and it's not okay. Yeah. And part of it was a lie of what she was doing. It was over-exaggerated or whatever that was. But it was completely coming honest about that story and about the behaviour and about shifting the responsibility to where it fell, and that was on the man. And I think that was like week 18 or week 19 that we did that process. And it was quite funny to watch the patterns that would come back after each group. And after that group, we always got a similar story, and that was men would come in and say, okay, how did you go last week? What have you got to report? And there was a similar story that was starting to come through, that they said, Andrew, mum said, no, my baby boy, no, that's not right. It is her fault.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we'd start to pull that apart. I'd say, with the guy, I'd say, what do you think that's about? And, well, he said, Dad's been abusive, all the marriage, and they're in their, 60s or 70s, and Mum's always protected him. So I think that's a little bit too much for Mum to, if Mum has to admit that, I'm the problem, that means she's got to admit that, where she's been for the last 40, 50 years. So sometimes those family structures can reinforce that story, and a lot of the men said how difficult it was to really come out and start to own that in the family and social peers as well.
So the family of origin could have normalised that behaviour of the man being controlling and abusive, and then the woman in that position falls into a state of learned helplessness and then justifies it as well, that's just normal, and that, maybe your wife is being a bitch and you're justified in treating her that way. So even the women, through their victim learnt helplessness, play along with the game to help perpetrate it, even to their sons, in justifying and excusing. That was one of the patterns you recognised.
Yeah, it's like both men and women are exposed to that narrative. That if you do talk back to your man, that's what it's deserving. Or so I think for domestic violence or for violence or disrespect to be perpetrated in a relationship, it's an agreement between victim and perpetrator, and the victim usually has a narrative around, well, I did deserve it, well, I shouldn't have done that, and the perpetrator has a very similar one, well, she did do that, she deserves it. So when there's a match like that, that's when it continues on. Until something breaks.
So I want to divert this just a little bit to the side. So I've done a fair bit of work with couples as a coach and counsellor, and I've had people come to me, women in particular, start out by saying that they're in a domestic violence relationship, and that they'll come and see me for some coaching or counselling, and I ask them to explain everything, like, give me all the data. And they always, well, usually, not always, mostly they paint this picture of that, they're really quite angelic in their behaviour, and that everything they're doing is just showing up as the perfect partner, and that they've got this monster of a partner who's, for no reason whatsoever, being controlling, domineering, emotionally or physically abusive. Whenever I'm hearing those stories, it never really adds up to me. I know that there's something missing in that story, and what I'm not hearing is any accountability or responsibility on behalf of the woman. And so I listen for a good hour because I really want to get their world. And then I ask them, like, when did the violence start? What form did it take? And eventually I get to the question of, well, so who hit who first? And I'm always see this surprised look on their face, as though they've never been asked that question before. And at least half the time, the woman will say, I hit him first. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm glad I asked that question, because by you striking your partner, that's communicating to them that violence is an acceptable form of communication. And then that's the message. I don't know what other message you can be giving when you do that. And then, unfortunately, if that man has poor self-control and he strikes you back, then you're in that kind of relationship. And so that's something that's not well known, I think. I think the average person who doesn't have the exposure that you and I have by working with these populations, what we get to discover through inquiry is that the women can be just as violent or abusive in the relationship, that the man isn't just acting out of nowhere. I'm not excusing violence on the part of men to women or women to men. But I think the average listener wouldn't know that in at least 50% of the cases, And that's, from a small, study group, because I haven't worked with hundreds of people. I've worked with dozens. But it's still an indication that the women can tend to invite that into the relationship. And then I ask them to take some responsibility for that. And I've even asked them to go to their partner and have a conversation about that when they hit them, that they were communicating that, and that maybe they contributed to that dynamic in some way. And so that, because they like to portray themselves as the victim, but then they're disempowered. So I ask them to reframe how they see themselves. When you hit your partner, you volunteered for that. You're no longer a victim because you volunteered hitting them and introducing violence into the relationship. Then when they respond with violence, you see yourself as the victim. Once you're a victim, you're disempowered. So you want to take responsibility for your part in communicating that violence is acceptable.
Well, there's also, if you're a victim, you need an oppressor to be a victim.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to have one of those.
Yep.
So what do you think, Pete, was underlying that, for want of a better word, inability to name that in the counselling process, that they had used physical abuse and that you had to flush that out? What do you think was underneath that? What was your experience of that?
So that the fact that the women didn't even think to look there?
Correct.
Sure. Okay. So this is a kind of shadow work conversation that you're pointing to now. And so most of us construct a persona of ourselves, and our persona is the social mask that we wear in public, and that's designed to give off a good impression, but to hide certain shadowy aspects of ourselves or parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at or acknowledge or take responsibility for. So, and we all do this, men and women alike. We all have this squeaky, clean, perfect persona that we use as our representative in social situations. And so when the women are coming to me, they're just giving me their persona, which is, look at me, I'm this perfect partner and I'm attracting these monsters, who are mistreating me. And then I just say, well, hang on, I want to look behind that perfect persona that you're presenting to me because I don't buy it. What's in your shadow? What is the part of you that you don't want to look at or that you don't want to face? I'm appealing to that part. So if you're willing to show me that, and to their credit, when I asked that question, most women were happy to say, you know what, yeah, I hit him first. There's a bit of your shadow, because you've come in here painting yourself on the right side and painting your partner on the bad side. Mm-hmm. And when we make an inquiry, we find out, well, hang on, it's a bit more even than that you're both capable of both good and bad things. And so our shadow is an aspect of ourself that we don't generally want to confront, face, or take responsibility for. So that's what I think is going on when women want to paint themselves as the victim, their partner as the perpetrator, and they're disempowering themselves when they do that because they're not looking, well, how am I attracting these kind of men? And why am I staying in the relationship when that shows up? What can I take responsibility for? What can I be accountable for that this is showing up in my relationship? So when I'm working with people like that, I'm looking to empower the woman to see what it is that she can't see about herself that's putting herself in that position. And if she could see it, then she could alter her behaviour to stop that from taking place, rather than that the man's the perpetrator, I'm the innocent victim. And this is not blaming the victim. People call this, you're blaming the victim. No, it's not about blame or fault. It's about what can you take responsibility for.
Yeah, so pretty much what you're saying, Pete, is it's a process on both sides. We're empowering the man and we're empowering the woman where there's violence in a relationship. Because when someone's in their power, they will take ownership and they will make better choices and not choose violence.
Yeah, whenever I'm working as a coach and with couples, my approach is always not to take sides or look for fault, but to empower each individual to take responsibility for all their creations in their life. And one of the things, what are our creations? Our words, our deeds, our actions, our thoughts, our beliefs. So are you willing to take responsibility for what's showing up in your life? In other words, if you're in a domestic violence relationship, it's pointless to blame that on your partner. Yep. If you're not going to look at, well, how am I responsible for getting here, then you're completely disempowered.
But there still is a responsibility for the victim. The perpetrator is 100% responsible for his behaviour, and a victim is 100% responsible for their safety. So there's a part and there's responsibility on both sides. But the evolution of men's behaviour change programs from the 80s, when the Duluth model came out of USA, it was very much around, directed at behaviour, and it's the men's problem. And as you said, as it's evolved up to now, so when I was working in that particular time and where we were up to, it was very much the man's problem. It was very much, there was a lot of, and as we said before, he is responsible 100% for his behaviour, but it's very much looked at it only in that lens. So we're taking a man out of a system, that's his mum and dad and his family of origin that he grew up in, and the generations before him and his family that he's created. So we're taking him out of a system, also society. We're trying to pin a behaviour on him, change that, and then put him back into the system. And we know that has got limitations to it. So what I found as I evolved, and the way the therapy and the way we look at violence evolved, was that many of these relationships that turned up as a man being a perpetrator, they were co-abusive. And, there's a lot of literature out at the moment about women being just as violent as men. And in my experience, that's what I've experienced as well. But they use very, very, very different forms to express that anger and violence. Where men use physical violence, intimidation, standover. They use, the finances if they're the breadwinner. So basically they use what's available to them and what works for them as a man. And where women will tend to use criticism, attack, and really cut the man off at the knees.
Character assassination.
Yeah, character assassination, manufactured indignation, innuendo, and psychological, emotional abuse, where it's very hard to form any sort of argument against that, to form any sort of accountability, to have a process when someone is using those techniques in a power imbalance in a relationship. If someone's been physically abused, there's evidence. You can ring up the police and say, I've been hit. It's obvious to you. Right. If someone's trying to gaslight you, there's still a big bruise on your face. Right. The evidence overwhelms the belief or the gaslighting. Where that's what gaslighting is for, to get you to believe something that might have been a reality. But when there's physical evidence, it's a little hard to do that. So they're very different forms. And from my experience, I found that the majority of the time they were co-abusive relationships. And the all-of-family approach that I used or developed over that period of time was to work with the man and woman separately in that process, and to empower or to get that therapy process, to get them into that and invite them into that process of being strong in your feminine power, or to be strong in your masculine power, and what's different about that, and how that feels differently, and what a state of being that can create. And I found the success comes from people who really embrace that and who really feel that. And it can be a very strong curative factor, rather than shaming or blaming or trying to get someone to be accountable in that process. It's a very respectful process, especially from being a therapist, when my intent is for you to be your best and really flush out of you what that looks like and how do we get there. it can be a very very empowering process. And sometimes my clients, it's the first time they've ever been in a relationship like that, with parents or with brothers or with partners, didn't have someone that cared for them that much, that they were totally honest with them, respected them, and wanted the very best for them, and could sit with whatever turned up in that room. So for most people I worked with, that was the first time they experienced that. So then we can look at how attachment plays into that as well. That's got to have a part in that as well, that's underlying that.
So men can be physically violent in relationships, and women can be violent in different ways, or let's just say aggressive. So a man, when he's aggressive, will resort to physical violence because that's what men do. But women are equally as aggressive as men, but they generally don't resort to physical violence, although they can, and in 50% of the cases do.
Yes.
But they have this other repertoire of being aggressive, which is character assassination, psychological and emotional abuse. In your own personal relationships, have you ever encountered a relationship in which the feminine showed up as emotionally or psychologically abusive?
Okay, so now we're going down a little bit of a shadow rabbit hole. Yes, as you know, from working with you, Pete, and doing your shadow course, it really cemented in a lifetime of work, really embodied what I'd been working on all my life. I had such a commitment to working through my shadow, and how I sabotaged my own life over the years. But my shadow was the victim. My first relationship, my first marriage, my wife was verbally and psychologically abusive, manufactured indignation, what I call fucking with your reality. She might do something or say something and I'd say that's not okay, and she'd turn around and go, no, I didn't say that. So what I call that really starts, over years and years, it really starts to weigh you down, where that person's really messing with your reality. And, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts or death by 1,000 concessions. One's okay, but after years and years of that psychological abuse, the criticism, the attacks, I experienced that very, very, very strongly. And then when that relationship finished, I started a new relationship, and that particular partner of mine was physically violent. And many, many times over the period of time we were together, and to the point where my life was threatened, and it was nearly taken, was the point where I had to really look at what was happening. There was another point in my life where I had to really self-evaluate what was happening. But I had some good friends at that particular time, yourself included, Pete, that really put a line in the sand around that behaviour. So I took some time off counselling. I thought to myself, I've got to, there's a shadow aspect here somewhere. I've really got to take some time out to look at this. So I stopped working, and that was part of my ethics too. I've got to be able to walk the talk here.
Yes.
Yeah. So there were some aspects of my counselling that were on point, but obviously there was this area that needed some attention, and as I call the shadow work, it's your blind spots.
Yes.
And if they're your blind spots, you can't see them, so Correct. You need help.
Yeah.
You need help from somewhere, and that's where the shadow course was really intrinsic in pinpointing and those blind spots, or that shadow part that kept repeating, but it was done in such a beautiful way that the lights just kept coming on and on and on. It was just throughout the course as the weeks went on, it's just undeniable, and having that support and feedback and that process was really, really helped me in embodying my true self, where that shadow part of me was playing out, wasn't allowing me to be the man I wanted to be, and
So just to help define that for the audience who may not know what we're referring to when we say shadow. So the shadow is just something that we don't know about ourselves, or a blind spot, or something that's hidden. So you started to do some shadow work, looking at what is it that I can't see about myself. And I'm just curious in particular to the relationship where your partner was being physically abusive to you, and that continued over time. What did you discover? What was the hidden thing that you uncovered about yourself that had you uncovered it in the relationship, you might not have tolerated that physical abuse?
Yeah. The blind spot, or that shadow that was playing out, was, as I said before, was the victim. And I had a really clever setup around it that kept that shadow going. Because I could write a thesis on that last relationship. It was available to me in every way, shape or form. I would sit down with my partner and do the right thing and name the abuse and how it affected me, and put a boundary in place, and try to work with her around what was underneath hers, and what was, and then saying, let's work on this together and build our relationship. And
so you took a counselling approach to your personal intimate relationship, which is always a recipe for disaster, but at least you attempted something.
Yeah, but the blind spot was I was convincing myself I was doing the right thing. But as I discovered, it was just a way to, it wasn't real, it wasn't authentic. I was trying to get someone to stop abusing me rather than take responsibility for my boundaries and my mental and physical health and do something about it. But I had this beautiful structure around it. If I just help her, and if I just do this, and
if I can just get her to change,
yes,
then I'm clever.
Yeah,
and rather than how am I keeping this pattern alive?
Correct.
What can I take responsibility?
My part in that. Yeah. And as I mentioned before, there's an agreement there. There was an agreement there. There was a cycle that was in play, and then obviously once I start to then there's no consequences to that, and when I start to do more work than the other person to get them to change, then it'll never happen again. I'm so sorry, and even to myself saying, wow, I really respect this person. They're taking accountability. They're naming it. That's great, and we're really getting somewhere. And then there'd be another explosion and violence again, and then I'd do the same and sit down and try to work through it again, and so the same pattern just kept repeating. So until it got to a point where it was threatening my life mentally and physically. So that's when I took that time off to see it, to really having to look at what's actually going on in this process.
We had a brief conversation yesterday about this thing, and I brought up the book by Eric Byrne, Games People Play. It's a great book, and I know you've read it and I've read it. So not all games are fun, and some games can be life-threatening. But to me, there's a particular game he talks about, and that's how I see where you were at in this relationship with this person who was showing up as abusive. And he titled that game, Now I've Got You, You Son of a Bitch. And that's how I see the game that you were playing, because your partner was showing up that way, and you were falling into the role of, I'm going to show you where you're showing up as the perpetrator. And when you finally admit to that, then now I've got you, you son of a bitch, rather than looking at the game from, well, hang on, what's the payoff? What's the payoff for me?
But the thing was, Pete, that I knew this was happening. I could name it. I had many discussions with many counsellors and support people. But for some reason, that, as I said, that setup was so strong That shadow aspect of me was so strong. But what you say is that game. I think there's more than one.
Oh yeah,
one game happening in one.
Sure.
Yeah, there's quite a few, and I think there was, on self-reflection there, which I've done a lot of. There was a family of origin pattern there.
Mm.
If I can just get her to love me, if I can just get her to be nice to me, if I can just get her to respect me, then I know I'm lovable. So there was something similar to that pattern happening under there.
Where's that show up in your family of origin, that pattern? Did you not feel loved by your mother?
It goes to mum and dad that were very cold. They didn't have an ability to love and express their love. They were pretty caught up in survival, and so in that family of origin there was probably traits of an anxious attachment came from that, which was also underpinning that shadow part. But as I said, there might have been a little bit of attachment issues there. There might have been some games underneath there. But what I found too was there was also a masculine narrative and a feminine narrative under there as well. And it comes out in little sayings like, happy wife, happy life. And the focus being on the woman. So there was a belief in me that her needs were more important than mine. Mm-hmm. And if she threw a tantrum or a hissy fit, there must have been something wrong with me. I had to attend to that. Yeah. So over a period of time, the focus became 100% on her, trying to manage her behaviour, her hissy fits, her threats of I'm not happy, I'm going to leave. So what I found myself doing was my focus was 100% on that behaviour, which I lost the pillars that kept me strong, or keep the masculine strong, which is, a brotherhood, your spirituality, your purpose, your children, your extended family, and your peers. They over that period of time left my consciousness, and it was all about focus was on her. So from that space, obviously those pillars are going to fall over, and that's how that's when that ended. It was that's when I did the shadow course, stopped working to have a look at how this is really all playing out.
What I'm hearing is that, so with your mother, your birth mother, that she wasn't necessarily present in terms of being a nurturing, healthy attachment. You probably, do you feel that there was a missing experience there in terms of feeling loved, supported, securely attached, and that so that you were looking for that in your relationships? So there was some sort of son-mother wound. So because how you're showing up in relationship, if I'm just good enough, they'll love me.
Yeah. I think it comes more to I was getting the affection and attention I needed. It was just the abusive behaviours that I wanted to stop. So it was more around if getting into that space where over a period of time, as I say, death by 1,000 paper cuts, this happened over a period of years, that I was just enveloped in this place, not being able to see until it fell to pieces.
You say though that you recognised them as abusive behaviours while they were happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so you're in a relationship where you recognise that your partner's being abusive to you. You stay in the relationship rather than choose to leave.
Yeah.
And the reason you stay in is because
I think I can manage it. Because it is cyclical. It's not there all the time, and I think I can manage it. And somehow being in that place, I had to take on the narrative that was put onto me. Somehow it's your fault. You're not being good enough, Andrew.
Yeah.
You're being disruptive. You made me cry. You should be doing better. Right? So over those years, it was, and then creating that self-doubt in me that maybe I am. Maybe I need to try harder. Maybe it is my fault.
So the reason they're being abusive to me is because there's something defective about me. And if I just try harder and find my flaws and work on them and then show up as they need me to show up in order to make them happy, the abuse will stop.
Correct.
That's the other game.
Yeah.
Because that is a game that you can't win. Because it's not your job to make your partner happy. You're not responsible for your partner's happiness or unhappiness in a relationship. You can contribute to it, but it's not your responsibility. It's their responsibility. But a lot of people fall for this. I just want to labour this point a little bit because I've certainly fallen for this. This was one of my patterns in previous relationships. If my partner was unhappy, it was because of me.
Yes.
If she was happy, it was because of me. It's too much responsibility. I can barely take responsibility for my own happiness and unhappiness, let alone to take on someone else's.
Correct.
So I do acknowledge that I can contribute to my partner's unhappiness or happiness, but I'm certainly not responsible for her emotional world. And that, for me, that, you know, I still am managing that conversation. You know, how can I be responsible for someone else's emotional world? It's, you know, we need to take responsibility for ourselves. And so...
So it goes back to the same narrative, right? She has to believe that she's entitled to that, and then and we have to believe that it is our fault for there to be agreement. Yeah. So both people have to take on the narrative for it to work.
So when your partner was abusing you, you were internalising that and saying there's something wrong with me. If I just improve, if I'm not enough, if I just, you know, attend to her needs, then the relationship will work. And so did you attempt to change how you were being, or?
Definitely. And I also think too, there's a narrative when a woman hits a man that it's minimised, and that we should be able to, you know, deal with it and handle it. And that's seen on lots of levels, you know. There's a lot of shame for men around that. There's if you go to a police station, there's a lot of shame in that, and there's sometimes rejection of that as well, and minimisation from authorities and from society in general. But I think once you get hit from a male perspective, from a female, straight away there's disrespect. Laying your hands on someone is disrespectful. And I think once a man accepts that, then he doesn't respect himself and she doesn't respect him. And it's never a one-off. It's always a pattern, and it will continue.
Are you saying that when you were hit in your relationship and you put up with it, you lost some respect for yourself?
Absolutely. But at that point, the narrative was too strong. That I should be able to manage this. I'm a man.
That's overriding.
Yeah, the attachment, her what do you call it? Discourse that it is my fault. So there's many things in play to that kept me from taking full responsibility.
Let's take a break for the benefit of our audience here. So I want to name this particular behaviour that you've mentioned a few times, where your partner denies things over and over again that actually did happen. You know, no, this is not a glass of water, when it actually is a glass of water, and they'll just consistently deny, no, it's not. Or the behaviour where they go, it's all your fault, it's all your fault, it's all your fault. So that kind of communication is called gaslighting. So that's what gaslighting is, where someone tries to convince you that things that are non-true are true. And that's a deliberate ploy to confuse you.
Correct. And
to undermine you so that they can gain ascendancy and dominance in the relationship. And so if somebody's continually blaming you as the problem in the relationship, you're being gaslit. Because in my experience and I've worked with lots of couples, it's always a 50-50 split as to who's contributing to the mess in the relationship. And I don't even use the term blame or fault, because no good comes from those terms. I look at, well, what can you be responsible for?
Yeah. What's your part?
Yeah.
What are you responsible for?
Yeah. And so when you look there, you don't have to take fault or blame anymore. You can say, well, no, it's not my fault and I'm not to blame, but here's what I can be responsible for. It's a totally different conversation with different outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. You're inviting that person into a process of, as I said before, that empowerment process. And when you take accountability for something, or when you own something in yourself in strength, it's an undeniable power. But getting back to what we were speaking about that process, it does come from years and years of slowly being worn down. And then once you're there, it's you're embroiled in that process.
So making concession after concession after concession.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've recently been in a relationship where I think you were sharing with me, you made lots of concessions, lots of small concessions over time.
Yeah.
Okay, what was the motivating factor behind you willing to make those concessions? What was what were you up to?
At that point, that old narrative was in, where it was trying to keep her happy, trying to be equal, trying to do the right thing as a male. And in that process, that gaslighting process comes in, the hissy fits come in, and over that period of time, that space that's respectful, that space that's equal and a place for commitment and working through things gets destroyed over a period of time, and then trying to come together to work through things, to compromise, to work with things. I got to a point where I left the relationship, named it very clearly and said, look, I can't let someone physically abuse me or put hands on me. It's not okay. And I left the relationship. And, weeks later she came and, apologised for it and did the buyback, I'm sorry, et cetera, et cetera. So I said, okay, well, if you want to have a relationship, these are, this is what I need. You need to probably get some counselling around that. And I got a whiteboard out and we spent the whole weekend writing up what we need to do, solution focus, what happens if we come to a deadlock or we can't compromise, what do we do? And so we spent the whole weekend
Mapping that out?
Mapping the rest of our lives out. And there was, thank you, Andrew, you're an amazing man and you've really shown the way forward. And, but it lasted about a week before it happened again. So what I got from that was that it was transactional. It wasn't from her, it wasn't coming from her white hot desire. It was coming from consequences. It was coming from a buyback position, and it was me again trying to map the way forward instead of letting her map the way forward. It was me doing too much work, and me thinking that for this pattern that had been in play for so long, that was part of my naivety, that it was all going to stop if we could see it more clearly on a whiteboard and we could both map it out and she could articulate it, then it was going to stop. Yeah.
It's interesting because it's really quite simple from a behavioural Skinner point of view, is that B.F. Skinner, the behaviouralist, if you reward bad behaviour, you're going to get more bad behaviour.
Correct.
So if you really want to simplify these things, when you're in these relationships, when your partner's showing up with, these toxic or bad or dysfunctional behaviours, if you reward those, you're just going to get more of it. And so it's about boundary setting, isn't it, really? It's about, well, look, I'm not okay with these behaviours, And if these behaviours continue to show up, then we need to question whether this is the right relationship.
Well, what I got from your course, as I said, I thought I was doing, the right thing and trying to work with it. But what I got from your course, that was just part of the game, that blindfolded me. I conned myself into thinking I could work with this. I could use compassion and empathy and understanding and working with this person. That was all a little game I played within myself.
So if that's the game, what's the authentic position? What did you discover as your authentic position?
Well, the authentic position, as I said, like cognitively and intellectually, I had that.
Yeah.
Right. So it was an embodiment of that. It was like it's if that makes any sense, the embodiment of I am responsible. Full responsibility came from that shadow course. I can't blame anyone else. I put myself in that position.
Right.
And the working through as I said, the narrative that underpins it, working through the attachment that underpins it, working through my own game, and seeing that that's external. It's all external, and then bringing it back to me, where I don't allow that to happen.
So the inauthentic part of that, or shadow part of that, is I'm in this relationship, it's toxic, but how you were showing up is, let's just call it the fixer. I can make this right, I'm going to fix it. And that's the inauthentic bit, that's the shadow bit, because... So what was the authentic version of you that's not the fixer? Like, this is not an issue where I need to fix my partner who's showing up with toxic behaviour. So as you were showing up was the fixer. How are you now as an embodied person? And you say you attracted another partner that had similar behaviours. Clearly, you're not going to try and fix it anymore because that was the game you were in. What's the new version of you that's the antidote to the old version?
Okay, so as I've spoken about through the interview, Pete, different stages of my life, embodying ethics and authenticity, and my spirituality and growth in spirituality. The last few years in the journey I've been on, which culminated with your shadowboxing course to sort of bring it all together, was that another level of authenticity. As I talk about helping men find the anchor or find their who they really are, and to be that man. So mine is to embody my Christ consciousness and to follow Jesus. That's my ultimate, right? So in doing that, stepping into another full level of authenticity and truth. And that truth has now come into me is where I can't let that happen. Yeah, I that's not okay for me. And that invitational model that I built for others, I'm now embodying within myself. Here's my frame. I'd love you to step into it, but if you don't, that's okay. And I can walk away from that.
So Jesus as an ideal represents the highest truth.
Yes.
And that you discovered through doing shadow work where you weren't being completely truthful with yourself.
Correct.
And your frame, and that you were offering up some other less authentic version of yourself that wasn't really you holding your masculine frame. And that your highest truth as Andrew is Andrew who recognises that and is willing to make a clear boundary around that. There's an invitation if you want to step into me showing up in my full authentic self, then I'm here. But if you're going to show up with the game, I'm no longer going to play the other role in that game. That's not who I am anymore, because I recognise the inauthenticity in that for me. So having Jesus as a God or some higher power greater than myself, it's no longer about me. It's about me stepping into a higher truth.
It's between me and him, not anyone else on this planet. But it goes back to what I was talking about, the pillars, the importance of these pillars in my life. Having that spiritual pillar to strengthen my life. So if the relationship does fall down or there is abuse in that, I've got the other pillars strong in my life and that are a priority rather than the focus. which had been that I'd focused on her rather than my spirituality first, rather than my purpose, and then my wife, and then my children. Yeah, so for me, it's understanding that, that me, to be a better man, I need to put God first. I need to put my purpose first. So I'm the better man. So I'm available to my wife and to my children. And if I focus on her, I lose those pillars that make me who I am, give me my sense of self.
So it's almost like you need a true north on your compass to guide you, and that true north is represented by your values as a person, and that your values are shaped by a Christian ethic, in that you value truth, accountability, responsibility.
Yep.
And so you're making it about something bigger than yourself, because if you just make it about you, if you're the highest purpose and your life's going pear-shaped and you're in a world of misery and upset and you're the highest thing in the world, then you're pretty soon going to collapse into a spiral of shame and guilt because you're not showing up as you want to be, because you're the highest thing. But if I have something to move toward that's bigger than myself, which is this higher truth, then that will shine a light on where you're not being authentic. And so that's that role that spirituality can play. If we make it just all about ourself, then we focus on the negative aspects of self, we can fall into a pit pretty quickly. But if I've got these values that I value over and above my feelings and my upsets, and use that as my north point on my compass, it can help direct me in times like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think having that, losing that pillar was intrinsic in my, what would you say, sabotage, how I sabotage my relationships. And I'd say I sabotage myself, the way I sabotage myself. The analogy I like to use sometimes is a cupcake. You know, the cupcake is made from my purpose, my spirituality, my family, my health, my connection with nature, my brotherhood, you know, my peers, my friends, my brain's trust. So that's the cupcake. And when I have a relationship, it's like she's the cherry on top. But if I lose the cherry on top, I've still got my cupcake. So
I was just thinking of the book by David Data, The Way of the Superior Man, and he has this concept in there which, you know, has definitely influenced me, where the difference between the masculine and the feminine is that a man, an empowered man, ought to be focusing on his mission and purpose.
correct.
And that's the kind of highest thing for a man to put his attention on. Whereas a woman, it's more about putting the attention on the relational stuff and the relationship and raising children. And just, you know, there's always exceptions to the rule, because not every woman has children. Doesn't mean she can't have a purpose or whatever. But for generally speaking, when a man focuses on his mission and in his purpose, then he's aligned, and that man is present. And usually that man will attract a high-quality woman into his life because he's focusing on the right thing. But if a man starts to focus on the relationship, it somehow feminizes or emasculates him, distracts him from his purpose.
Correct.
He's now less attractive and he's lost because his job's not to focus on the relationship. And women focus on the relationship. And if you catch, you know, like an evolved or aware, self-aware woman, my current partner, who I'm very happy with, I trust her when it comes to relationship, and I defer to her on relational issues. She's not always spot on, but because that's her focus and that's her purpose, is to focus on relational stuff, I go, well, look, I'm focusing mostly on my mission, so where do you think the relation's at? What do you think the relationship needs? And when I listen to her, generally she's more correct than I am, and so I defer to her on relational issues, and I keep my focus on my mission and my purpose. And so it's acknowledging those strengths within the sexes. And so at one point, you probably deferred your attention away from your mission and purpose and put it on the relationship. Did you think that was, in hindsight, the wrong place to put your focus?
Oh, I think, yeah, absolutely. That's what I got out of the shadow boxing. That's what I got from from where I am today, that was my hidden part, that I'd go into the relationship in my strength, in my power. As I've always been, had a purpose, focused, had my spirituality. There was lots of, things going on in my life. And what I want, a big reason for me working with men and being here today is to give my experience of holding your frame as a man. And even though you might have that when you enter a relationship, our purpose is to hold that frame throughout the relationship and have support from other men and other men's groups to have that support to be able to keep that frame. Because what you just said previously is so important, because it can be chipped away over a period of time for many, many reasons. But it's up to us as men to hold that and keep that frame and keep our purpose, keep our spirituality, and keep us being the best versions of who we are, putting a dent in the universe, being that man that we want to be.
Yeah, so I'm going to put myself in the position of coming to you for some counselling, Andrew. Because I'm dealing with this thing at the moment, and I'd like your opinion on it. Sure. And I've come to you before, and I've always found, you a good, wise counsel. Because one of the things that I'm dealing with in my relationship at the moment is I've discovered that a very important need of mine is respect. And so what's showing up in my relationship currently is that I don't perceive that I'm getting the right amount of respect from my partner. And by respect, I mean that I'm not being seen for who I am and what I'm contributing. And in fact, sometimes I perceive my partner in the way she speaks to me is potentially showing me some disrespect. And so, and we've had some brief conversations about that, and we're still in that dynamic, in that conversation. And so, yeah, I don't know what's behind this need in me for respect. I guess it's something like I work quite hard and diligently to show up as the man I am. I'm an honest man. I have integrity and responsibility and accountability, and I'm transparent. Mm-hmm. And so I've worked hard to be that kind of man. I then also am a provider and protector in my relationship.
So that story you're telling yourself right now, how does that fit? You notice that you were very clear in what you wanted, and then you went into this little story to justify your respect.
So I'm needing to justify the respect that's the problem?
Just then you started to do that. I don't know if you need it or not, but I'm just saying, did you notice?
Okay. I noticed.
I went into justification.
Yes, I did. I definitely went into justification.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for pointing me there. Yeah, I feel that I need to justify why I need respect.
But
and that's part of the...
But just to start to notice when I feel disrespected and I feel powerless, because you need something. When you need something from someone and they won't give it to you,
you're vulnerable.
That's a really powerful, really powerless place, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And if they won't give it, what do I do then?
I request it.
I start to justify. I've got this story that I should have it because look what I do.
Yeah.
So there's this story that underpins it. That what does that do? It props up my justification for respect from someone else. When I used to work with couples and families, sometimes I used to get, especially families, when I used to do family therapy, a family would come in and say, Andrew, we've got a 21-year-old son and he won't respect us. What should we do? And I used to do a deliberate provocation in my therapy. It was deliberate. I used to go, no, sorry, you can't have that.
Can't have what?
Well, they're wanting their son to respect them.
Okay.
And I'm saying, no, you can't have it.
You can't have his respect.
No, because they're asking, how do I get it? So you can't have it. How do you get someone's respect? How do you make someone respect you when they won't?
You can't. You can't make someone respect you.
So they'd continue to ask the same question, and I'd say, you can't have it.
Right.
Until where they got to the point where they'd go, okay, what do we do now? And I'd go, great question. What do we do now?
Okay, so if I'm to extrapolate that into my position and come from the place of I can't have my partner's respect, what do I do now?
If you can't get that from her,
Yeah. By requesting it or justifying
pleading
it
with
or
it,
whatever.
okay,
so
trying to work it out.
If I can't have it and I can't get it, what would I naturally do next?
It's very similar to my story that I just told. I'm wanting something from somebody, they won't give it, trying to navigate, to compromise, to somehow try to get it from them. And that bound me up.
I guess I don't really know the answer, but what comes to mind is that, and this is something that is emerging more and more, is self-respect. So I have more respect for myself now at 62 than I did when I was 45. So possibly the answer is that I don't really need respect or for my partner to be showing me respect, even though I would like it. What I would like, knowing that I might not get it, is that. But that if I can provide that for myself, which I can, because I do respect myself, then maybe that goes away, or that need of having it from her goes away. But it
So how would you do that? If I start to focus on my self-respect and what I need internally and stop trying to coerce somebody to respect me, how would I do that?
I don't know if I coerce her. I request it. How do I coerce her? Like I'm not negotiating anything. I'm just saying what I would like is to be respected. I'm not saying I'm not going to take something away if you don't.
Yeah, what I mean by, I use the words coerce and manipulate. It's the meaning I have of that. If I go to work in the morning and smile at somebody, it's a manipulation because I'm wanting a smile back. So it's not in a negative sense. It's what am I doing? Because you're wanting something from somebody else and they're not giving it. So what I'm asking is to have a close look at the ways that I'm trying to get that. What do I do? What happens to me when I don't get that? I've got a story that underpins this, but what happens to you, Pete, when that happens?
I'm disempowered and a victim.
And what happens? What do you do? What do you do?
Well, I feel upset.
Yeah. And then what behaviours come out? What happens?
I distance myself.
Yep.
And I judge my partner as unwilling or incapable of showing me the respect that I believe I deserve.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely creating a victim out of myself and disempowering myself through that process. And maybe the if we bring it back to first principles, maybe telling myself that I even need that is the beginning of the creation of that story. So if I need my partner's respect, then I'm going to go and try and get it.
Yeah, but in a way, it's not a need. Respect is not a need. Respect is something that I get when my boundary's broken. Disrespect is what I get when a boundary's broken. A need is more like affection, attention, presence, etc. So when my boundary's broken, I feel disrespected in that place. So when my boundary's broken and I feel disrespected and I look inward, what do I need to do to feel and to model that self-respect rather than to get it from the external?
Okay, so I need to clearly define my boundaries, clearly define the boundary that's being transgressed, that's leaving me feeling disrespected. Yeah, so it's more about me modelling and taking ownership of what's okay for me and what isn't.
Okay, so in that space when that happens, you said that you just described to me a little process. I tell myself this justification, then I feel disrespected, I feel betrayed maybe, then I move away, then I blame her. So there's a little process there.
Yeah.
And what you just said to me then, I think, is at that very point I need then to take self-responsibility and read that, okay, I need to stop And I went, okay, what do I need to do? Is that right?
I just went back to like early childhood and found the origin of the source of it was that I was always looking for my father's approval. And, nothing I did was good enough to get my father's approval, no matter what I did, no matter what I achieved. I became first in class in primary school. I became quite a good footballer. I went to university to become an accountant, all to try and get my father's approval. And so I'm seeing, like, taking it back to where did I first learn that I need this approval from someone in order to feel okay. So this historical thing there.
Yeah, but what I saw was that response going into that place with a beautiful story behind it, then a blame on the other person, and then these feelings, and then me distancing myself, and then feeling totally powerless because I don't get it.
Yeah, I can look at taking responsibility for creating that whole pattern. My partner's just being my partner.
Okay.
And I'm creating this dynamic or story around it that I need respect and I'm not getting it.
Okay.
Because I'm not getting it now, I'm upset.
Okay, whose boundaries are they?
They're my boundaries.
Who's responsible to enforce them?
Me. Yeah.
But in that process, you're saying, I'm going to try to get her to be responsible for them. And I'm going to get her to respect them rather than you just told me I am. So there's an incongruence there in between that triggered part and who I really am, my powerful Pete. Have I got that?
Yeah. So it's the childhood wound that's triggered because I'm not being seen and approved of for who I am, which is what I wanted as a child from my father. And that's showing up in my relationship 60 years later. And I'm making it about them rather than looking at, well, what can I do differently? How can I do differently?
Okay. The feeling comes back. It doesn't show up. The feeling comes back. The recognition comes back. But I choose to go with it. I choose to continue the story.
So that's what I have been doing.
Yeah. So what do you need to do now, Peter? What's the in knowing all that, in seeing that, what's the next step for you?
Well, just take back ownership. To take back ownership if it's not about my partner not giving me respect. Yeah.
How would you do that in the moment when that part of you, and it's doing its job really well. It's warning you that there is disrespect there. So when that happens in that moment, how do you bring that other part in? How do you bring that part that wants to take self-responsibility, that wants to feel powerful, that has all that? How do you bring that in at that point?
So what do I do differently when I'm not feeling respected?
When the trigger comes.
Yeah.
Because that emotion's pretty strong. I'm not saying it's easy. It's pretty strong, and it's there, and it's there. Its purpose is to protect you, but that's all it's doing, is protecting you. It's not expanding you.
Well, one of my values and one of my beliefs that I have, or one of my guiding principles, is if that I've got something to say, I need to say it. So that's why I've had a conversation with my partner around not feeling respected, and so I believe I need to continue to do that. However, I don't think I need to make that her responsibility. I think I can look at taking ownership of how I'm sabotaging myself by creating that dynamic that I need her to show up a certain way.
So if I've got this right, I need to recognise this old pattern and this feeling that comes up that's really strong.
That I'm triggered.
Yeah.
And that I'm going to put it on that it's you that's not respecting me enough. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Rather than that this is an old wound.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that I need to take ownership of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it's a shadow part, and that it's a fruitless pursuit.
Yeah.
And that that I need to take self-responsibility.
Yeah.
For my boundary. And at that point, I know that I'm not being the man I want to be. I'm not putting my boundaries in place. I'm not enforcing those boundaries.
Yeah. So then what comes to mind when you say that is that if I'm going to take responsibility for having clear boundaries in terms of what I need as the masculine in a partnership, is that if my partner shows up in a way that's disrespectful to me, then I need to model through how I'm being or my behaviour that that's not ideal for me, that's how she's being, and to, I guess, withhold, like, the only thing that I can think that would model that boundary is to withhold a privilege, because to access me respectfully is to be privileged by what I have to offer in relationship. And so I would withhold some privilege that she has with me until that respect's there. And then that she gets the best of me because that one of my needs is being met.
Yeah. If it's okay, I just want to respectfully meet what you're wanting from me at this point, how deep we go and how I challenge you. Is that okay, Peter? If we go a little
as much as you like, Andrew.
Yeah. So just if you notice, just notice how I'm unsure of what to do with this boundary.
Of course I am,
Yeah. I'm really unsure at this point. Okay. So I don't know what to do down the track. Okay. So for me, it's just noticing this, Pete, right? Not doing anything more than just notice. Okay. So I've got to notice when I go back into this old pattern, when I'm triggered, how strong that feeling is from childhood, right? From my dad, right? How deeply that's ingrained, and just noticing, right? There it is. Okay. Not doing anything else at this point. Noticing how strong it is, how powerless I feel, and the pull to do, the pull to get someone else to respect me, right? Which is obviously against your ethics. I know you. I know the man you are, and you're very much around accountability and responsibility. Right? So noticing how it pulls you out of who you are, right? And I'm not voicing and putting a very clear boundary in place. Okay. And once I do that, once I start to practice that,
Practice what?
What I just went through, noticing the pattern.
Practice the noticing.
Practicing the noticing. What I want.
Triggered.
Yeah, and I'm wanting to now go back into this whole pattern. Okay, there it is again. Wow, okay, I notice. Notice there's that emotion. Right? Once I start to do that, okay, I'm not even sure what to do with this boundary being crossed. Okay, wow. Right, just to be in that space and to practice that space. When you practice that enough, it will come to you.
But so what I'm doing is, rather than sitting in the discomfort of what's being triggered, I'm rushing to find a solution. And in my solution, I'm going into demanding respect, rather than sitting in the space long enough to feel the connection to the old wound and allowing that more time, more space. I'm deeply triggered here.
Yep.
I feel like I need to do something. I have no idea what to do other than demand what I want.
Yep.
And that's futile.
Yeah.
So that so then come back to just sitting with, this is my experience.
Coming back to the authenticity of that, because I know authenticity is very important for you. And if I don't know what to do with it because this emotion's overwhelming, I could tell you now what to do, and you know, but with this emotion being so high, it confuses me. I'm confused, and I'm not solid in how I'm going to produce that.
I think that's a very good point, that when I'm emotionally triggered or activated, that the emotion clouds the clarity, and that by sitting longer in that feeling, allowing that feeling time and space, it loses its power. And that as the emotion loses its power, the clarity, the light behind the heat can shine through. But if I'm stuck in the heat of the emotion, I'm clouded. So your coaching is, or your counsel is, to don't jump into feeling like you need to take action on this, but just notice that something's triggered, notice that you're making it mean that you're not being respected enough, and sit with that, allow the emotion to
dissipate
or move through it.
To get familiar with that emotion so it doesn't have the power anymore. Once I do that, the solution will become available. And then when I'm in a place where I'm really powerful and really strong to be able to stand behind whatever that solution is to that boundary crossing, I can then put it in very clearly with power and strength.
But I was just hoping you'd just tell me what to do, Andrew.
I just did.
You're telling me I have to do the work. Touche.
I'll let that go to the keeper, that invitation.
Yeah, so thank you. I think that's wise counsel. I think that I do, when I'm triggered like that, I don't rush in because I sit with it, but I just sit with it in an annoyed space, and I allow the annoyed space to dominate rather than recognise, oh, this is an old wound, and that...
But I know you very well, Pete, so I'm able to work with you very quickly, which we've done these conversations before. To the listeners, Pete and I help each other with problems quite regularly.
We counsel each other.
And we get to the point pretty quick. But it has highlighted the process I was talking about is very similar to what you're talking about. But I know that authenticity is very important to you, Pete. And that process of being able to find the solution that's authentic and real to you for a boundary crossing, and then to be able to place that with strength and faith. Right? So if someone crosses a boundary, to be able to really mean it is important to you. I know that's important to you, right? And I noticed that you lost that space, right? So the process for me was just to get you to notice how I lose that and what's the story I underpin it. And there's a little story that comes up about if I only can get her, if I do this, if I do that. And that feeling that comes, yeah. So there's a process of you being able to just sit in that until you get that solution, until you get that power, until you have power over it. And because for me...
Well, it's a point of powerlessness because it's learned helplessness, because as a child I wanted the approval, never got it. So I learned that it's helpless to get approval. Yeah, but and because I never got it. But that same thing's being triggered now is that it's helpless. I'm powerless to make a difference.
But what's important is that whatever happened in the past is happening now. That emotion is so strong, right? It's very strong, and I want to acknowledge that too, Pete, that it's that emotion is very strong and very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's happening now.
Yeah.
And when that emotion comes up, what you also said to me, and you helped me with this, little Pete comes in to fix that. Little Pete did everything he could to get his father's approval. So when that emotion comes up, I do everything to get that other person's approval if they're disrespecting me. Right? Mm-hmm. So it's little Pete comes in to fix that, where you want big Pete to come in and fix that, to work with that. Pete that can articulate a boundary, can do that with love and authenticity and strength, but still self-respect.
Which is what I thought I did when I had a conversation with my partner recently. I thought I was just coming in with love and respect and compassion to let my partner know something that wasn't working for me. But it's still coming from a motivation of wanting her to change and be different in order for me to get what I need.
Yeah.
So how do I distinguish between...
It's got nothing to do with her.
So how do I set a boundary if I don't have a conversation with her about what I want?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But what I'm saying is making sure that Big Pete's got that, not little Pete, and being able to sit with that until that emotion.
I see what the distinction you're making. So rather coming from a wounded space, which is little Pete, I come from a space of adult to adult with my partner,
Yeah.
there's an issue in our relationship that I would like to name, and I'd like to have a conversation to negotiate around it. And this is the issue, how I see it, and how should we work together as a team to address this aspect of our relationship so that we are both getting more of what we want in the relationship, as opposed to I'm wounded, I need you to change.
Yeah. Well, it's like I use the analogy of my wife used to borrow my car. I said, "Can I borrow your car, Andrew?" And I said, "Of course you can, darling. Just make sure you fill it up." Right? So I'd get in the car the next day and it'd be on empty and I'd be late for work. Right? So little Andrew wants to not upset her, right? Because that gaslighting will come in. "Darling, you didn't fill the tank up. Right? I asked you to. When you borrowed your car, you made an agreement with me." Right? So I get attack and character assassination and manufactured indignation and tantrum and you're being unreasonable and I've got so much to do and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then little Andrew wants to say, "Oh, I know, darling, that's okay. And look, you still got to do it." Blah, blah, blah. And me wanting to get that respect from her. Well, next time, can you do it? And rather than, "Darling, can I borrow your car today?" "Oh, sorry, darling, you don't fill it up, so I'm not gonna let you have it. We had an agreement, and you disrespected that."
Yep. Yeah.
I don't have to get her to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty clear.
Yeah. So the process of talking or explaining anything to her was zero.
Yeah. 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 Okay, well, look, I think that's probably a good place to wind it up. How do you
Sounds
feel
good.
about that?
That's okay for me too.
Lots came out of that for me, and hopefully it's not about me. Hopefully a lot came out of that for the audience as well. Thank you for your wise words of counsel and for willing to be in this conversation. I guess one last question. What's new for Andrew? What are you moving into? What are you moving towards? What's the next step in your journey that's standing out as the priority for you?
The priorities is to get my pillars of health, spirituality, purpose, meaning strong, so I can be the best version of myself. And then the next purpose or the next step for that is pretty much why I came onto this podcast, is to be able to share to other men and the next generation coming through what I've learnt, what we've learnt. And because I think there's something in our society we don't get. We don't get the fathers and the uncles that bring men, teenage men or boys through that process to pass on the knowledge and the wisdom of masculinity. So what's next for me is part of generativity, is to give back to the next generation, to help and support other men. And in that same process, as I've disclosed today, you cannot help but grow yourself. So it's a double-edged sword, and and I'm very, very thankful for it.
I think that's I guess at our age, once you hit 60, it's, you know, you've lived a good chunk of your life, and this thing emerges where, like, what have I learned that's of value, and that do I want to share that? Is it enough value to hand it down to younger men coming through, and is there a role that we have as older men to support the younger men coming through? Most of my clients in my coaching are young guys in their 30s, and some of them are doing great and want to do better. Some of them are making a complete mess of things and are looking for some mentorship or counsel. And so I don't mind that role. I've learned a few things about myself along the way, and generally I find when I convey that to men, they're grateful for that. And so And what I'm hearing you say is that you see a similar role in terms of yourself, is that I want to pass on any wisdom that I've gleaned so that we can create better versions of men.
Yeah, and I get that so much, Pete. A lot of young guys in 20s, 30s, 40s say, why didn't I learn this? Where did this come from? Like it's foreign to them to have, and as I was saying, to hand it on, a clear, defined masculine role, how to live in your power. And I think spirituality and for us men is very important, whatever that looks like. If that's connecting to nature or the universe or to God, whatever that is. But I think having that faith in yourself and faith in something higher can, when you have to make a decision as a man, which we have to, if someone crosses our boundaries or disrespects us, we have to make some very difficult decisions. And when you have something to fall back on, something bigger than yourself, and faith in all I know is I have to be true to myself, be absolutely authentic, and that's where I get my power as a man from. Not by bending to society or to anything. It's being true to myself and having faith that whatever happens, I've got that. And that's the fulfilling part of masculinity for me.
Awesome. Great. We'll wind up there, Andrew. I think you summed it up nicely.
Well, what I'd like to do is just thank you, Pete. You've been a very good friend of mine. We've been on a similar journey, sharing different aspects of our lives. We've been together in different forms of therapy in the medicine world and personal support for each other. And just to come on today and just to share a few things with you has been a real honour, so thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thanks for being willing to be a guest, Andrew, and I'd like to have you back sometime because we can go into our whole story of where we met in the psychedelic world and some of our journeys together.
Yes, we can.
All right.
Thank you, Pete.
You're welcome.
Pete Isaiah is an Australian trauma therapist and integration coach. You can find him at isaiahcoaching.com and connect with him on Instagram at isaiahcoaching. This podcast was produced by Quinika Davis, edited by Beck Isaiah and Luca Young, and the score was produced by Joshua Richards.